Most people who have traveled in the downtown area of Portland, Oregon, have probably at least once wondered why the grid system of the streets changes direction when one crosses Burnside Street. I'd certainly wondered passively about this, but recently, while just looking at a map of the city, I got a little more fixated. How did it end up like this? In particular, the north end compared to the original city to its south. It's a story with origins tying back to the very start of the city itself, its founders, and in particular a man who saw nothing but potential in this stretch of land along the Willamette River. First arriving in the Pacific Northwest in 1840, when Portland was still a few years from being established, Captain John Hurd Couch would become one of the city's most significant early settlers. You see his name everywhere. In fact, his name itself is something of a talking point in the city, as most outsiders would assume it's pronounced couch, because that's how it's spelled, but it's actually Couch. His name is particularly well known in the northwest end of town, where Couch Street runs through. There was once a Couch Lake in the vicinity of where Union Station is today. There's still a Couch Park, and even the old Couch School still stands next to it. And this is actually the second Couch School, with the original dating back to the early 1880s. And there's a reason that his name is all over this particular area. That being that he took out a land claim in this area way back in 1845. The actual borders around this land claim that later became known as Couch's Addition differ depending on the source and even maps done of the area. The south border has always been Burnside until its merging with Ankeny Street, at which time the border runs along Ankeny. The east border has always been the Willamette River. Only the north and west borders have ever been in question. Some descriptions have shown it only going as far west as 12th Street, with it most often said to be running as far as 20th or 21st Street. The northernmost border was most likely Marshall Street, at least originally, although some sources have it going as far north as Thurman Street. It's also possible and probable that the dimensions changed over time, especially considering the fact that Couch had to wait years to develop the land, briefly sold some of it before buying it back, and officially platted it at a different time from when he purchased it. And even maps tend to argue that the addition seems to have grown with time. In this 1854 map, we only see a small portion of it, which makes sense as Couch's Addition had not yet been annexed into the city. Then, in this 1871 map, it shows the borders of the addition going as far west as 18th Street and as far north as Marshall, or M Street at the time. But by the time of this 1891 map, it shows the addition going beyond 20th Street with a compromise line running between Couch's Addition and the land that another early settler, Amos King, owned west of there. It also shows the addition going as far north as Thurman Street. It really depends on the time and the source. Today's Couch's Addition consists of Old Town Chinatown, the Pearl, and the Northwest District, including the Nob Hill area to the west end. It's an area that can change vastly, even just walking a few blocks. You can see some of the most destitute aspects of the city, as well as its most affluent. But once upon a time, this was all just forest. and a barely accessible forest at that. While it would not be until a return trip in 1849 that John Couch would make Oregon his permanent home, he'd spent extensive time here in the 1840s. Born in Massachusetts in 1911, his initial trip to the Pacific Northwest came on the vessel Maryland, and with the objective of engaging in trade as he made his way along the Columbia River to the eventual Portland area. But with the Hudson's Bay Company having a monopoly on the area, his venture was not as successful as he'd hoped, and Captain Couch returned to the East Coast only to come back a couple years later in 1842. He saw great potential here, potential few others saw. And this time around, he stayed a while, settling in Oregon City for a few years. But while living there, he seized on an opportunity and took out a claim on the land just north of where the original Portland settlement would be. However, it would be some time before Couch could actually do anything with this land, because at the time there was still a dispute going on between the United States and Great Britain over who actually had control over the territory. But he'd come back to that later. During this second stay, Couch would establish himself as more than just a new local businessman, being appointed as the treasurer of Oregon's provisional government, a position he would hold until October of 1847, at which time he once again returned east, back home to Massachusetts. But his stay wouldn't last long. Come 1849, he would return for a third time, but this time around he had a few persons of interest with him. Namely, there was his first mate and future business partner, George H. Flanders. Flanders would also later share in the ownership of Couch's claimed land. Also, on this return trip, they brought a man named Benjamin Stark, another person who made a name for himself in the early years of Portland, and who ended up owning land right next to what would become Couch's addition. But before returning to Portland, they stopped off in San Francisco to sell the goods they carried, while also attracted by stories of gold being found in California. But in the end, they all came to Portland, and this time John Couch would remain until his death in 1870. During these later years, Captain Couch only improved on his prominence in the area, and was a critical figure in bringing business to Portland. In his book on the centennial history of Oregon, Joseph Gaston wrote, "It was John H. Couch that opened the commerce of Oregon with the world, and it was John H. Couch who settled the future of Portland as the commerce center of the Columbia River Valley." And even Couch's land claim in this case was business-driven, as he felt this land down by the river would be prime territory for a burgeoning seaport town. While few felt this young town would ever flourish, Captain Couch had no fears that it would grow. And while he arrived in a town of less than 1,000 people, by the time of his death, Portland may have only risen to just over 8,000 people, but it had experienced a nearly 200% increase from 1860. This would be the start of serious growth that would continue on into the 1920s. And John Couch's family as a whole fit in well with that concept that you marry into your own class. Couch himself married Caroline Flanders, the sister of his close friend and business partner. But beyond that, one of his daughters, Elizabeth, would marry Dr. Rodney Gleason, another prominent early Portlander whose name would ultimately replace G Street in Couch's addition. Another daughter, Clementine, married prominent local merchant Cicero Hunt Lewis. The land where Couch Park was built on was the former estate of Cicero Lewis. And a third daughter, Caroline, married another well-known doctor, Robert Wilson. And George Flanders respected his pal Captain Couch so much that he named his firstborn child John Couch Flanders. And he even gave one of his daughters the middle name of Couch, while naming another son Cicero Lewis Flanders. Unfortunately, neither of these two children lived beyond the age of 3. Cooch and Flanders would also be instrumental in bringing the railroad to the city, another method of transporting goods, while donating several blocks in their addition for terminal grounds as well as a train depot. And Union Station still stands there on Cooch's former land. And like most prominent Portlanders in the 1800s, Cooch was directly involved in the development and progression of the city's schools. But before much of that happened, back in 1850, Cooch set up a business in Portland along with Flanders, and was finally in a place to get to work in relation to his addition. At least early work, as even by 1860 it was reported most of the land was still heavily forested, uninhabited, and uninhabitable. This is not to say nothing had been done to this point. In fact, quite the opposite. First off, according to Harvey Whitefield Scott's History of Portland, someone else had staked a claim to some of Couch's land, which he would buy back upon his return in 1849. Land claims in those early Portland days ended up being rather complicated. In this early 1850s diagram of the city, which I will get back to more later, it notes that the land was broken into 4 parts based on who had control of the land. These 4 parts were owned by Benjamin Stark, Daniel Lounsdale, William Chapman, and Stephen Coffin. Lounsdale had obtained his portion from one of the city's founders, Francis Pettygrove, when the land really belonged to Stark. Pettygrove just got rid of it when Stark was out of town. This would lead to years of legal drama as Lounsdale's ownership came into question, along with the revelation that several others had taken out claims on various blocks in the area. This drama, along with some greed on Benjamin Stark's part, are what prevented the city's park blocks from ever being fully connected. Fortunately for John Cooch, he did not experience the same level of drama and had little trouble getting to work, which started with surveying his land. It is said that when the work was done, in lieu of a $700 payment, Cooch offered his surveyor 2 full blocks within his addition, which the surveyor declined. While he is not specifically named as this surveyor, it is known that a man named Absam Halleck did survey work on Cooch's addition. Regarded as Portland's first great architect, Halleck came to Oregon in 1850. He would be instrumental in the architecture of Portland in its early years while forming a business with a local contractor named William McMillan. They would operate out of a building on what is today Oak Street and the Nadeau Parkway. That building, built in 1857, is Portland's oldest still-standing commercial structure. In his later years, Halleck would relocate to the Oregon coast, where he would establish a homestead at a place that would later become known as Bay Ocean. Later, this area would be converted into a resort community, something that was called an Atlantic City of the West. But erosion issues there by the ocean would ultimately take effect, leading to the collapse of the whole community, one of Oregon's most gripping coastal stories. Once platted, Cooch's land was still not yet part of the city, although its addition was inevitable, and it bordered along Benjamin Stark's land claim, as well as, for a time, a portion of Daniel Lounsdale's claim. And this is where we get to the main question of this video. Why, when one crosses Burnside Street specifically, do the streets travel in different directions? Why not have them all line up going in the same direction? Well, nowadays, the key issue with this setup ties in with traffic congestion and the complications one can face driving in the vicinity of Burnside. But back in the 1850s, locals were hardly thinking about automobile traffic. Otherwise, aligning all of the streets may have come to mind. But if we look back at that early 1850s diagram of Portland, one thing we notice is that the borders of the land claims run at an angle similar to the angle of the streets in downtown today. Every part of these borders is at an angle, except for 3 instances. Where the borders meet the river, which makes sense, but also on the north and south borders, where things are more horizontal. This means that with Cooch owning the land to the immediate north of this, his southern border was already going to be horizontal, or running east and west. But that's only one border. Why didn't Cooch align some of his other borders, or even the area's early streets, with those to his south? Well, first off, in relation to borders, Cooch, seaman though he was, had a focus on his land by the river becoming of great importance to the city, and thus he wanted his addition to function in line with the river, which is clearly what those before him did as well. Because one can also ask, why did all these early landowners have their claims angled like they were? And beyond that, why were the city's early streets also angled in a way that still exists today? They were done so to run in line with the Willamette River, which, just past Burnside and the end of Cooch's addition, starts to angle to the southwest. And the, so to speak, north and south running streets in town ran parallel to that, with the crossing east-west streets crossing those in a standard grid pattern. But once entering Cooch's addition, at least over the first few blocks, there is a bend in the river wherein the river continues in a northwestern direction. Being in line with this bend, Cooch set up a grid system based on true north, and thus the streets in his addition did not run at angles, but rather east and west and north and south respectively. And hey, what of the south end of early Portland, Stephen Coffin's land, which had a southern border that ran east and west as well? Well, a similar thing happened, as much of the land south of Coffin was claimed by a Finis Carruthers, ultimately becoming Carruthers' addition. And, like Cooch, his addition did not go in sync with the likes of Coffin, Chapman, Lounsdale, and Stark either, and his streets ran north and south and east and west. His also existed near the river at a point where its direction shifts once again. And today, when one crosses Lincoln Street to the south end of downtown, we see the streets turn again. However, today this curvature of the streets does not affect the people as much, with Lincoln only running as far west as 5th Avenue before encountering I-405. Back to Cooch's addition. Needless to say, there were some issues on the border between Cooch and Stark's land. In particular, Cooch wanted to build a street right on his border with Benjamin Stark, but Stark wasn't interested, so Cooch ended up making a narrow street only on his side, which would later become A Street, and then Ankeny Street. And Ankeny Street today, on the west side, is still very narrow, with most of its blocks not even open to traffic. And that's another early key element of Cooch's addition, those very streets that didn't play nice with those beneath them. Today, starting from Ankeny Street and moving north, the names of the streets running east and west are in alphabetical order, with Burnside being the next street, then Cooch, then Davis, then Everett, and so on, all the way to Wilson Street, where a Roosevelt Street in place of the letter X breaks the pattern, even though the next street resumes it, with York Street. But it was a bit of a name journey getting from those early years even just to 1891, when these streets had more than letters attributed to them. Initially, Cooch just applied letters to the streets running east and west. And I don't mean A Street, B Street, C Street, and so on, but literally just A, B, C, and so on. In Harvey Whitefield Scott's aforementioned History of Portland, he described this naming scheme as follows. Upon the addition of Cooch's donation claim, all effort to think up names, significant or pretty, was discarded, and the bareness of nomenclature for which Americans are remarkable, the letters of the alphabet were used for cross streets. Even by the time of this 1871 map, while the numbered north and south running streets are listed by their full names, each cross street is only acknowledged by their letter, even though by this time these streets had been given names. A Street, B Street, we've already been through that. And the 1891 transition of alphabetized streets to streets still alphabetized but named after prominent early Portlanders achieved an objective for John Cooch. Even when the streets were named after letters, he still said that F Street, for example, was named after George Flanders, and C Street would eventually become Cooch Street. The area would become nicknamed the Alphabet Addition, and today is better known as the Alphabet District, with the Alphabet Historic District existing roughly between Burnside and Marshall Streets, as well as 17th and 24th Avenues. As mentioned earlier, even by 1860, the land was barely habitable, but this quickly changed as Cooch sold off timber growing in his addition to local sawmills, helping along in Portland's strongest early industry. This opened up more land for development, and even by the time of this 1864 newspaper article, it discusses how rapidly the area had changed. And that rapid development, filling in the blocks over time, solidified the streets as they were, removing any possibility of them being put more in line with those blocks south of the addition. It wouldn't be until 1872, when a new city charter was established, that all of Cooch's addition was annexed into Portland. At this time, the city was also broken into 3 wards, with the northernmost being any land north of Washington Street, and thus Cooch's addition was part of this ward. And in addition to lots of timber in those early years, there were several waterways, including Tanner Creek, which ran into a large lake to the east end of the addition. That would be known as Cooch Lake. While the lake would be gradually filled in during the 1890s, while John Cooch was living in the area, he had a home built by the lake in the vicinity of what would today be 4th and Burnside. This fit in sync with the earliest homes built in the addition, which were near 3rd and 4th Streets, close to Burnside. But over time, residential homes would shift to the west of here, with the Nob Hill area becoming a particularly charming community. The blocks closest to the river shifted in a commercial, industrial direction, as was Cooch's hopes in the first place. And we still have reminders of the industrial structures and mills that have stood along the river here for so long, in particular structures located north of the Broadway Bridge. Sanborn fire maps from 1889 give a general picture of what the area was like, with few buildings existing east of 8th Street, due primarily to the size of Cooch Lake. But still, between there and the river, we can make out businesses along the river. And we can also see in this very area between 8th and Park, the thin blocks that made up the North Park blocks of today. With John Cooch helping bring the railroad into Portland, railroad lines increased around town, in particular towards the west side of the addition. This would lead to an explosion of warehouses all through what is today the southern part of the Pearl District, including the 13th Avenue Historic District. Even today, this area is still lined with warehouses that started popping up all over near the start of the 1900s. Industrial and warehouse buildings filled most of the Pearl, along with lots of railroad land, but after this area started becoming known as the Pearl in the 1980s, it began a swift transition to a trendy and expensive place to live. And yet, despite this transition, there are still so many reminders of another time to be found between the throngs of more recent architecture. And further west, beyond I-405, we have the far west end of the addition, mostly taken up by Nob Hill. Once a trendy place to live a long time ago, it still has that charm, and is one of those places where lots of older architecture still remain. For me, what I love the most about this area is the collection of older apartment buildings that exist all around and in a multitude of different styles, many of them coming into existence between 1900 and 1930. Some blocks, that's all there is. A line of cool old apartments. And then there's the easternmost portion of the former Cooch's addition, the part that's in Old Town Chinatown. While mostly just riverside businesses and railroad land in the early years, in the later 1800s this area started going by various nicknames, including Whitechapel, named after a once rough part of London, famous for being Jack the Ripper's stomping grounds, and the North End. Gradually, most of the city's vice was forced up into this area, be it illegal booze operations, drugs, prostitution, what have you, thus moving out of the middle of the city where its main commercial district was, as well as its most affluent citizens. This area also became home to much of the city's Chinese population as they migrated north after many of their homes and businesses were destroyed in the Great Portland Fire of 1873. Hence the area's historic designation as the city's Chinatown. This area was also home to many of Portland's black residents in those earlier years who often could only find work with the railroad companies. This area would also become the city's Japantown, with much of its Japanese residents living within a small collection of blocks in the Chinatown area. As the 1900s moved along, the area, in particular around Burnside, was best known as the City of Portland's Skid Row, a name that the area has never fully shaken. It was a prime gathering area for the unemployed, as it once used to be full of employment agencies, and was a prime slumming place for men working in the timber industry when they were out of work. As time passed, it became a haven of older, mostly alcoholics, who filled the rundown flop houses that peppered Skid Row. And nowadays, the alcoholics have been replaced primarily with the drug-addicted and mentally ill. Many of the addition's oldest, still-standing structures exist in the area as well, including the 1883 Synod House, the 1880 Seaman's Bethel, the 1880 Merchants Hotel, and the 1875 Norton Hotel. It was one time just a particular patch of land that became the driving force behind the development of what is Northwest Portland today, and it exists today in many different ways with many attractions. The former Cooch's addition is the home to Union Station, the Armory, the remaining Lovejoy columns, Powell's Books, a dazzling collection of old apartments and warehouse buildings, and so on. With population growth bringing increased traffic to a downtown area connected to a well-developed area to its north, the decisions made many years ago in terms of how the land was platted have had an effect. The likes of Cooch, Stark, and Lonsdale couldn't have known that a street once simply identified by the letter B would become a prominent thoroughfare. So much so that it would become the dividing line between the north and south parts of the city. With progress, there has always been growing issues with Burnside and issues that can only be adjusted to a certain extent. Since we clearly can't change the directions of these streets to make them all match, we have to just do what we can to work with them. Over the years, Burnside Street has developed the nickname of the Burnside Barrier, for obvious reasons. And remember, back when John Cooch platted the land, he did so with the plan for streets to only be 60 feet wide. Thus, if you go back far enough, Burnside was a fairly narrow street. Back in the 1800s, it already served as the primary border between Cooch's Addition and the land below, and a main connector with Washington Street, which headed into the West Hills and served as a main route to places like Beaverton. Eventually, this stretch would become part of Burnside as well. And come 1894, a bridge would be completed across the Willamette River, making Burnside an even more significant route. Burnside became overcrowded, and the need to widen it to handle the traffic was unavoidable. By the end of the 1920s, and carrying on into the 30s, a major street widening project happened along Burnside on both the east and west sides of the river. To make the necessary space on the west side, the front facades of several buildings were removed, thus leading to several thin buildings standing along Burnside today. While helping traffic on the southern border of the former Cooch's Addition, this did not do much for those traveling from the south of Burnside. With how the streets through here are angled, the named crossing streets come in at much greater angles than the numbered avenues. This makes sense as Burnside itself is a crossing street, meaning these other crossing ones, theoretically, should be running almost parallel to it, making the angles sharp, primarily for someone coming from a crossing street and trying to cross Burnside onto a numbered street. And with streets from Ankeny to Morrison all merging into Burnside at sharp angles, over the years, many of these streets in between have been altered or set up in such a way to keep one from hitting Burnside at such a sharp angle. For instance, what still exists of Ankeny Street runs mostly parallel to Burnside, ending at the south end of the North Park blocks. And some numbered streets south of Burnside have been made to turn facing north before intersecting with it, such as 9th through 12th Avenues, after they cross Harvey Milk Street, formerly Stark Street. In recent years, Harvey Milk, before merging into 13th and Burnside, had been closed to traffic and open to pedestrians. Streets like Pine, Ash, and Oak all end before even reaching Burnside, and the construction of I-405 removed the once prominent intersection of Washington Street and Burnside. With Morrison Street intersecting with Burnside near 20th Place, this is to the west end of Cooch's Addition. So, perhaps no surprise, west of this point the streets begin to change. For instance, Yamhill and Main Streets start running east and west, like those streets north of Burnside. At this point, we would be on the land that was claimed by Amos King, an area known as the King Hill Historic District. With many of these crossing streets ending before reaching Burnside, a given driver is often forced onto a numbered avenue, providing them an easier crossing into places like Chinatown or the Pearl, which in relation to Burnside, they would have to do anyway if they intended on turning left anywhere between the river and 17th Avenue, as there are no left turns going east or west, aside from eastbound traffic at 4th Avenue. So if one needs to go to the left, they'd have to turn right, go down a block, turn, go another block, and turn again to finally be able to head left from Burnside. Another element of what makes this street a barrier. But it's also that way to keep traffic from backing up on a stretch that has no turn lanes, again with the exception of 4th Avenue. There is so much more to Cooch's Addition beyond Burnside, but again, we are here with a focus on the complications created by the fact that Cooch's land did not go in sync with those to its south. With Burnside being the border here, it is the primary complication in this matter. And several other projects along it have been planned or happened. Even by the end of the 1930s, there were suggestions that it needed to be widened further, with a considerable stretch west of 9th Avenue widened during the 1960s. The 1960s also brought on the highly unpopular Burnside Street one-way couplet project, with plans for one-way traffic on each street going in opposite directions. Still, by the end of the 60s, this stretch of Burnside was considered rundown and blighted, with the stigma of being at the heart of the city's Skid Row. Finally, in 1975, a new revitalization project moved forward, including adding medians and trees, as the area had become known for having some of the highest carbon monoxide levels in the city. In recent years, the Portland Bureau of Transportation did work along this stretch, as it had become known for having a high number of traffic accidents, many of which were pedestrian involved. But to reverse the effects created by these mid-1800s era land claims is going to take a lot more than these projects, and it's something unlikely to ever happen. And Lord only knows the cost and red tape that would come with such a project. This is how Portland has looked through here, on maps and from high above, since its early years, and it ain't going away anytime soon. And is it the greatest burden in the world to have to deal with some Burnside area traffic drama? No. But it's something else. To look at this particular area and the issues it brings, and know its origins weren't some recent half-cocked reconstruction plan. It didn't stem from some 60s era urban renewal project, or even a leftover oddity from the early 30s widening, or even something from the 20th century in general. But it goes back almost to the very beginning, and a few decisions made wherein the parties involved had no idea the effects they would have on the future.